Black Labor, White Wealth: The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 3: Impediments to Empowerment and Economic Justice. Blacks ought not swallow belief that they cannot digest. Claude Anderson. The Constitution has historically been and continues to be an impediment to black political and economic empowerment and self sufficiency. During the formative years of this nation, the Constitution outright excluded blacks from the privileges of citizenship, the acquisition of wealth and power, and the enjoyment of the fruits of their own labor. Moreover, the Constitution shackled blacks so the members of the majority white society and other ethnic or racial groups could use blacks for social economic gains. The social acceptance and grants of wealth that the government has given to European, Asian, and Hispanic immigrants, but withheld from blacks, left blacks decidedly ill equipped to compete with the more advantaged groups. Worse, the Constitution is again being used to block even the slightest effort by blacks to redistribute resources to remedy the wealth and power imbalance between blacks and whites. Conservative forces within the court system and government now seek to maintain the status quo of inequality between blacks and whites by mandating the blacks and whites be treated equally in all future endeavors. Any efforts whatsoever to correct the past injustice are found to be unconstitutional forms of reverse discrimination against whites. Thus, equal protection has come to mean the equal treatment of fundamentally unequal groups, which in effect perpetuates the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and resources. White society enjoys a virtually monopoly over wealth, power, and governmental and business resources because to a large degree the Constitution to decree that whites would solely possess those advantages. Equality for blacks therefore amounts to any other than the equal ownership and control of resources and power because the Constitution sets the legal, civic, and racial tones for the nation and placed numerous impediments and obstacles to black empowerment and self-sufficiency. The following is an analysis of the obstacles that the Constitution has used to impede black people's progress. Obstacle 1: Constitutional racism, termites in the foundation. The Constitution had formed the foundation of the subordination and exploitation of black Americans by perpetuating racist attitudes and hurtful behavior towards blacks. The Constitution espoused values of individual rights, freedom, and opportunities, but gave slaveholders the legal right to deny blacks their personal freedom to benefit from their own labor. Further, since the framers of the Constitution did not consider blacks full human beings, they did not assign them individual rights. Thus, blacks were never really meant to be included in the Constitution at all. Professor Harold Cruse spoke of this tragedy by stating, "The legal constitution of American society recognizes the rights, privileges, and aspirations of the individual, while America has become a nation dominated by the social powers of various ethnic and religious groups. The reality of the power struggle between competing ethnic or religious groups is that an individual has few rights and opportunities in America that are not backed up by the political and social powers of one group or another. America is, in principle, a majority rule society. However, in areas of the country where blacks constituted the majority of the population, all manners of legal and illegal means have been used to ensure that they nevertheless cannot wrest control from whites. Whether blacks were the majority population in Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, or inner cities of many urban areas, a white minority controlled the halls of the government. The framers declared the nation to be a democracy while operating a southern plutocracy, a government ran by wealthy class of plantation owners. In 1786, the framers of the Constitution laid the legal foundation for a black white wealth and power imbalance by number one, counting blacks as three-fifths of a person, number two, postponing for 20 years the effective date for outlawing the slave trade, and three, obligating the government to defend fugitive slave laws and use its force to suppress black insurrection and violence. The federal government was a co-conspirator in black slavery. The Constitution placed white wealth interest over black personal rights because the framers were wealthy, conservative white men. More than 31% of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention were slaveholders who together owned approximately 1,400 slaves. The framers were idealists, but they were also racist. James Madison and George Washington were two of the larger and more prosperous of all constitutional delegates. Their capital investment in slaves would be worth approximately $105 million today. They and their fellow delegates protected their own slave investments and the nation's free labor system. The delegates believed that black slave labor was necessary for the development of the nation and the prosperity of white Europeans in this country. All of the nation's power and wealth were in the hands of white males. Any anti-slavery sentiments that might have been voiced did not prevail. The well-being of blacks were not a concern. The framers spoke out against concentrated power in the hands of the British, but ignored the concentration power within its own developing aristocratic ranks. The accumulation of all powers in the same hand, whether one a few, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, cautioned James Madison, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. If the concentration of power in the British hands constituted tyranny, why was that not so when it was concentrated in the hands of white colonists? Blacks became permanent victims of tyrannical majority when their lowly role was inscribed into the foundation of documents. The framers obviously did not foresee a time when blacks would be anything other than slaves. The Constitution fused the broad concepts of property ownership and related rights with English slave laws. Once blacks were classified as property, the English insisted that slaves, as property, had no rights beyond the rights to perform as requested. The framers codified the Constitution, their belief that property ownership rights were superior to slave human rights. As slave owners, many of the framers obstacle to racism in the Supreme Court and the legal system. The Supreme Court has been a major player in the denigration of blacks. It has exercised power that the Constitution never gave it in order to overrule the U.S. Congress. In the famous 1857 Dred Scott decision that concluded that blacks had no rights, the Supreme Court made itself co-equal to the U.S. Congress and began issuing rulings that declared congressional acts to aid blacks were unconstitutional. According to the Constitution, courts were supposed to be sanctuaries of judicial objectivity, fairness, and justice. It is ironic, then, that for nearly 200 years, only wealthy white male lawyers served in the high court. And even today, there are the overwhelming dominant class of judges and justices. The judicial system cannot be fair and impartial to all citizens because judges' decisions naturally reflect their experiences and beliefs. How fair and impartial to all is a judicial system that is composed of 99% conservative white males? How
Unbiased.
are the court's decisions where the judges are appointed to elected because of their social and political ideologies? The Supreme Court interprets freedom is both its strength and its weaknesses. Because of political appointees, the justices, to some extent, reflect the views and philosophies of the appointed president and seeks to maintain the status quo. In his book, A People's History of the United States, historian Howard Zinn lamented the court's biased class interest, stating that despite its look for somber, black robed fairness, the Supreme Court was doing everything it could for the ruling elite. Only the politically naive would believe that presidents would appoint individuals to the Supreme Court who did not hold social political views on race matter that were similar to those of the president. During the 1980s, the litmus test for judicial appointees was support for the conservative cause on race matter and drawn from the Constitution and not case presidents. The conservatives' slap in the face to Black America was the appointment of Clarence Thomas, a black man, to the Supreme Court. Thomas was ultra-right-wing conservative, sees the world through the eyes of the white framers of the Constitution rather than those of Black America. Former President George Bush said Clarence Thomas was the most qualified candidate in the country who knew what it was to be poor. In a Washington Post article, April 18, 1994, columnist Jack Anderson disagreed with George Bush on both counts. According to Anderson, Thomas' writings and decisions denoted someone who disdains the downtrodden and is callous about protecting civil liberties. Thomas's court opinions supporting the beating of handcuffed prisoners, gender discrimination in selecting juries, and denial of immigration rights to Black Haitian refugees show him to be a judicial activist whose legal interpretation parallels the views of the drafters of the Constitution. Supreme Court decisions are based on the Constitution, but since original intent of the Constitution was to enslave blacks and deny them their humanity, fairness of blacks is impossible. To change the condition and make them sympathetic to black goals of empowerment and wealth would be to drastically change the intent of the framers. If judges rely on original intent, blacks would have no rights. According to Eric Black, there were serious disagreements among the framers on many issues, but on the specific issues of slavery, the framers' original intent was crystal clear. The framers intended to approve and codify the subordination and exploitation of blacks into law. They intended to reward slaveholders and give them extra representation and power in Congress. And they intended to make it unconstitutional for anyone to attempt to harbor or assist a black slave. Seemingly, these intentions were very strong forces underlying the Constitution. It is likely that blacks would have continued their battle for constitutional rights in the 19th century had they not been discouraged by the Supreme Court's unrelenting pattern of biased interpretation of black people's rights under emancipation and the 14th Amendment. A critical examination of court ruling and the legal status of Black America prior to 1954 Brown decision should make even the hardiest optimists wonder why blacks would try to seek protection from any court, especially the Supreme Court. Over the last century and a half, various court rulings followed a circular course from indifference to hostility to benignity. The Supreme Court stood silent while lower courts emasculated the 14th and 15th Amendment. There were few, if any, favorable rulings for blacks during the first 160 years of the court's existence. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott's decision in 1857 reflected the prevailing attitudes towards the legal rights of blacks. Although it had taken 11 years for the case to reach the Supreme Court, the ruling was swift and sure. The Dred Scott decision stated empathetically that neither free nor enslaved blacks were considered to be citizens and hence could not sue for their freedom. Representing the majority opinion, Supreme Court Justice Taney wrote, "Blacks are inferior beings and as property. They lack citizenship and have no rights that a white man is bound to respect." Following the Civil War, Congress, for partisan reasons, modified the Constitution to eliminate the most egregious wrongs against blacks. In the late 1860s, Congress enacted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These constitutional amendments were specifically enacted to abolish slavery, grant black citizenship and with equal protection, and establish voting rights for blacks. However, the Supreme Court emasculated the 14th and 15th Amendment with a succession of unfavorable court rulings that restored Southerners' control over blacks. The court's aggressive and negative rulings against blacks accelerated after emancipation. In 1883, the court voided the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and refused to strike down discrimination by individual citizens. In 1896, the Supreme Court further reinforced its notion that blacks were not to be respected when it gave its blessings to the Jim Crow system of separate but equal in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The separate but equal doctrine hung a cloak of respectability around 60 more years of unbridled discrimination against blacks. The succession of anti-black Supreme Court ruling and the Compromise of 1877 obliterated the purposes of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment for newly freed slaves. In the Compromise of 1877, the Northern champions of the blacks caused compromise to accept the Southern race system. The Southern conservatives and wealthy class that then experienced little difficulties in persuading the Supreme Court to ignore other constitutional revisions on behalf of blacks. Following the Civil War, history repeated itself. Southern whites again had control of the land, but had neither money nor labor. For the second time, black labor was commandeered and used to develop Southern economic and social structure. The Southern states passed highly discriminatory black codes to keep blacks in a position of servitude. The codes, a mandate for slavery, gave white Southerners a manageable and inexpensive labor force. The codes and subsequent laws and ordinances, as indicated in the appendix, made it illegal for blacks to engage in normal social behavior such as owning a dog, looking out of the same window as whites looked out of, raising and selling agricultural products, crossing a state line, and being on the streets after dark. The nature of these black codes effectively nullified the 13th Amendment and permitted local law enforcement agencies to arrest blacks and place them in involuntary servitude as criminals who had been duly convicted. It was common for local sheriffs to provide southern planters with imprisoned blacks for free labor. Blacks were forbidden to work without written contracts. They were also forbidden to learn to read and write, though they could not read legal contracts. They were bound to, and in all too many instances were arrested for having breached or broken the terms of their sharecropping agreements. The 13th Amendment contained an exception clause that cleared the way for nearly a century of involuntary black servitude because blacks had no income alternatives. Although the government had promised compensation to slaves upon emancipation, blacks never received promised 40 acres of land, tools, or the mule. Abandoned without resources, most black freemen had little recourse but to accept the white planters' terms. In some southern states, advertisement invited blacks to voluntarily re-enter slavery for the benefit of the South, the old white masters, and the nation. Just as the socio-political context nullified the effectiveness of the 13th Amendment for blacks, it also made the 14th Amendment a dead letter for blacks. The Equal Protection Clause, written into Constitution as a part of the 14th Amendment in 1868, but it wasn't until 1954 that this language was interpreted to make it unconstitutional to overly and explicitly discriminate against blacks. The court interpreted that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment broadly and applied them to many situations unrelated to blacks. By the turn of the century, the court used the new constitutional amendments primarily to protect the wealth of major corporations. In 1886, the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment on equal protections and due process to abolish 230 state laws that regulated corporations. Corporate legal counselors argue that corporations were persons and their money was property protected by the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. On the 14th Amendment case brought before the Supreme Court between 1890 and 1901, only 19 dealt with blacks versus 288 with corporations. The court showed favor to the corporations, but it ruled against blacks in all 19 cases. The court refused to hear the majority of cases involving blacks who were openly disenfranchised, exploited, and terrorized and lynched by the powerful and wealthy. Between 1882 and 1892, approximately 2,600 blacks were lynched. Obstacle number 3: absence of group economics in capitalism. The practice of perceiving and acting on issues and events from a social rather than capitalistic perspective is a major impediment to black empowerment. An old adage says, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." Blacks are in America, and America is a capitalist nation. Thus, blacks will have to adopt the American capitalistic approach if they are to build their economic strength. The founding fathers intend this nation to be an experiment in capitalism. Dr. William E.B. Du Bois, the preeminent black scholar, once described the concept to a black audience in Atlanta. He said, "Capitalism is like having 3 ears of corn. You eat one, you sell one, and you save one for a seed for next year's planting." Dr. Du Bois' definition is as a measuring device. Blacks have yet to practice capitalism. Black people are neither producers nor savers. Primarily, blacks are consumers. Blacks spend 95% of their annual disposable income with businesses located within white communities. Of the 5% that remains with black communities, another 3% is spent with non black owned businesses. It's difficult, if not impossible, for black communities to maintain a reasonable quality of life and be economically competitive when only 2% of their annual disposable income remains with black communities. Conditions in black communities are made worse by the fact that too many black business owners believe in developing their business but not the black community. They are short-sighted in valuing temporary business development above long-term community development. USA Today report on April 11, 1994, that of approximately $9 billion that went to Black 8A businesses from government set-aside contracts, nearly all of the black businesses were located in white communities. The tax revenue and jobs from these government contracts went into white rather than black communities, but supporters of the program explained that they fostered minority businesses, not community development. With black consumers and black businesses spending 95% of their income in white communities, whites live comfortably off double income, reaping 100% of their own and 95% of blacks' incomes. Essentially, black consumers and business owners have joined whites in boycotting black communities. Their failure to practice group economics further impoverish black communities. Obstacle number 4: pursuing myths and elusive dreams. To achieve economic power, blacks as a group must redesign civil rights traditions. Blacks are out of sync with the times and are still chasing civil rights. The process of rethinking our civil rights tradition begins with re-examining America's race problem from the perspective of black economics and political empowerment. The section below explores myths or dreams that are to their detriment. Myth number 1: integration. Real integration is a dream that will never come true for blacks. Even if it did, it would not change the nature of the black life in America. The reality of integration is that the integrating group loses all self-determination, since all plans and goals must be processed through the approval by the dominant society into which the minority groups is integrating. Integration is a detriment to blacks because the larger white society will neither allow blacks to assimilate nor give them assistance to alter the negative marginal conditions in which they must live. Black businesses and individuals situated in and wholly dependent on the continued acceptance and goodwill of white communities are vulnerable and powerless. They cannot change anything in the white communities or businesses because they are only guests. Integrated blacks' conditions are made more precarious by the reasoning that they have little, if any, support within the white communities, and they cannot depend upon receiving supports from black communities whose power were weakened by those who abandoned the community to integrate. Similarly, it is difficult for the non integrated black masses to identify with the integrated few. Therefore, both the integrated and the non integrated are rendered powerless by their social division. Power flows from the groups, the trunk of the tree, not in reverse from the individual or limbs to the trunk. So, as long as the black masses remain powerless, then every black individual remains powerless and vulnerable, even if they or their businesses are integrated. The integration process has major political significance in large urban areas where blacks are in control of government apparatus. When blacks are the majority population and are the controllers of government, the last thing they should be concerned about are integration and minority development. It is self destructive to continue to behave as a powerless minority seeking integration when one's group is the dominant majority population. While urban revitalization plans should be built around economically and politically empowering cities, black masses, black elected officials are reading outdated development strategies that suggest the best way to help blacks is to re-attract whites into the city. Such development philosophies are racist and short sighted. It confirms the belief in white superiority and black inferiority, that blacks cannot govern and progress without white involvement. Integration will be a no win situation for black people until they have sufficient racial power, wealth, competitiveness, and respect. At that point, integration will become just one of a number of options open to them. In summary, once blacks gain power parity, they will have the option of integrating or separating. Currently, they have no such choices. Integration requires blacks to give up their culture, values, and all that is identifiably black. The integration process is divisible and detrimental to black self empowerment goals because it dilutes and fragments their numerical strength, placing them further into the minority in a nation whose political principle is that the majority rules. Black people are the only group of people, ethnic or racial, that has consistently sought to integrate and continues to seek integration, though white society has repeatedly rejected them. Once blacks begin to integrate, they abandon their businesses, schools, and communities. They also lost disposable capital that is now redirected to white communities. They even lost their middle class black role models who follow whites to the suburbs. The loss of black capital and role models has left black communities across the nation impoverished and without leadership. And worst of all, under the integration, black people have had to share their goals, values, and behavior around white American standard through whites' approval likely will not reap financial or political gains for black people. Myth number 2: equal opportunity for all. Black America devotes a significant amount of time and energy chasing the myth of equal opportunity, which was the forerunner of the dream of racial integration. Both the myth and the dream are improbables. Inequality of power and wealth will naturally exist, so as long as human greed and competition motivates human behavior. On the other hand, the myth of equality perform an invaluable service to those who hold a disproportionate share of wealth, power, and material resources. This myth not only keeps blacks distracted from learning how to increase their share, but it keeps blacks believing that at least their children or their children's children will have a fair chance at the brass ring. The greatest service that the myth of equality provides for the dominant power holders in the idea that that if blacks are not successful achieving a fair share of power, wealth, and material resources, it is their own fault. Integration and equal opportunity are grounded in the belief that dominant white society will voluntarily share power with blacks. Power is rarely shared, especially between competitive groups. Power holders have no desire for equality. James R. Klugel and Elliot R. Smith, in the research for beliefs about equality, showed that whites resist changes regarding racial inequality because they tend to classify inequality that relates to blacks' underclass as non issues. Many whites do not believe that structural limitations impede blacks. Some even believe that if individuals would coexist with the social peers and stop trying to integrate, inequality would not be an issue. Everyone would be in common groupings, they reason. Whites will accept blacks as equals only when blacks have acquired parity of wealth and power. Pursuing the concepts of equality rather than the basis of equality, which is wealth and power, is a quagmire that bogs blacks down and wastes their time and effort. Conservative logic holds that if all people acknowledge that America is race neutral, then blacks have achieved their long sought equality without whites ever having to redistribute resources and power to blacks. Through the 1980s, conservatives checkmated blacks on preferential policies and quotas by arguing that America is a colorblind society and all governmental policies should be race neutral. The only way America will ever be colorblind is if everyone literally lost their eyesight. Conservatives have learned to use black rhetoric against black. They argue that any decision that is race conscious violates the 14th Amendment and is therefore unconstitutional. However, without preferential treatment or affirmative actions for blacks, structural racism will continue to advantage whites. This is the way the power holders want it to be. If the white power holders have wanted blacks to have equality, they would not have kept them outside and beneath mainstream society for nearly 400 years. Myth number 3: eradicating poverty. The way an individual or group perceives itself is a critical determinant of their drive and goals. Though blacks bear a disproportionate burden of poverty, it is a self-limiting exercise in futility for them to overly identify with poverty programs and policies. Poverty is a given in life. Affluence is poverty's fixed extreme. Both poverty and affluence are horizontal social and economic characteristics that inflict themselves on all racial and ethnic groups regardless of geographic location. Blacks ought to be realistic in their approach to poverty and poverty politics. Although poverty is a relative state among groups of humans, it is a given fact of life. It cannot be eradicated. Poor people's marches and government-sponsored poverty programs cannot eradicate poverty. And even if government policies and programs could eliminate poverty, the conservative, wealthy elite would not allow it to do so. Due to limited black resources, it would be a far more productive to view poverty as a vertical characteristic and concentrate efforts not on eradicating it, but on providing as many blacks as possible with education, wealth, and power building tools they need to lift themselves out of poverty. Myth number 4: cultural diversity. Cultural pluralism and diversity have become a very popular buzzword, yet the American melting pot has proven to be an optical illusion. Cultural diversity is a term used to equate blacks with other groups, though they are not. As a recent newspaper article reported, the demand of immigrant groups and other diluted and eventually trivialized the very special claim of blacks for national attention. Blacks are models, ethnic, racial, or gender groups, yes. However, a multicultural or cultural diversity ethic that equates all subculture grievances with those of blacks, belittling and neutralizes blacks' efforts to resolve their unique dilemma. Cultural diversity gives the dominant society unrestricted entry to black culture while socially and economically excluding blacks from white culture. Black culture is allowed to assimilate, though blacks cannot. For every ethnic group except blacks, cultural diversity has advantages. Main streets throughout America reflect the nation's cultural diversity by featuring Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, Italian, Greek, French, East Indian, Vietnamese, and Cambodian restaurants. These groups have the option to assimilate into the mainstream with their cultural intact. They establish other businesses, economies, and their own communities. Blacks don't have the benefit of an identifiable culture of their very own. A mismatch of African heritage, soul, and black history is offered as black culture. Cultural diversity or pluralism would be advantageous to them if all things were equal, but they are not. Myth number 5: Black ethnicity. Contrary to the popular rhetoric of social engineers, political pundits, and politicians, blacks are not ethnics. Ethnicity is the sharing of a common language, religion, culture, and set of racial characteristics. But blacks in this country are an amalgamated racial group. They share the English language but belong to every religious group, have no clear cut culture, and have a racially mixed family tree. Therefore, the concept of ethnicity does not aptly describe blacks and should not be used to merge black interests with those of other groups. There are those with specious motives who attempt to classify blacks as an ethnic group in order to blame them for not having reached parity with other ethnic groups. The movement to classify blacks as ethnics is political sleight of hand that springs from modern conservatives' attempts to promote their so-called colorblind political strategies. If blacks permit themselves to be classified as an ethnic group, blacks will suffer a major political loss. Leslie McLemore of Johns Hopkins University defined an ethnic group as those who differ culturally from the dominant population but share enough characteristics with the main population to be acceptable after a period of time. Apparently, non black ethnics are viewed as allies of the majority white community because they share common characteristics: non black skin, immigrant backgrounds, absent of the slavery legacy. Blacks have shared American culture for nearly 400 years and yet to be melted into the mythical melting pot. Classifying blacks as an ethnic group sets them up for a new round of benign neglect. Myth number 6: sexism is equal to racism. The form, degree, and intent of discrimination against blacks and women has always been vastly different and therefore should not be treated equally. Blacks are legally subordinated and exploited as producers of wealth and human comfort for a society that denied them the rights to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Contrarily, women as a protected class enjoyed the fruits of every black worker's labor, but were denied the luxuries of laboring with blacks to produce such fruit. Therefore, sexism is more a class issue and a class struggle. Equating discrimination against women to discrimination against blacks is like comparing a headache with cancer. Being a woman in the mainstream society may have its challenges, but it can in no manner be compared to being black in America. Yet, in the 1970s, the two struggles were linked. As one insightful writer noted, the class category of women was played in the same category as blacks, not only as being oppressed, but as suffering at the same degree of segregation, exploitation, and discrimination as blacks. The constitutional violation of the rights of women to equal citizenships were equated with constitutional violations of the rights of blacks. Nothing could be further from the truth. Through such social deviance as families, marriages, and racial segregation, white women have had access to the fruits of white males' wealth and power. Blacks have not. From a racial perspective, white women always had the advantage of enjoying the fruits of racial discrimination and the option of categorically discriminating against blacks. Blacks have never had a counter option of discriminating collectively against women. The women's movement supplanted the black civil rights movement more than a generation ago and has generated a demand for women power and sisterhood that now serves as a major impediment to black family unity and racial solidarity. It is no accident that every time blacks are on the verge of receiving relief from their oppressive conditions, the women's issue emerges. Both conservative and liberals support the issue to dilute entitlement to blacks. The first attempt by women to press their own cause to the detriment of blacks occurred in 1870. Women tried to push Congress to write them into the Constitution under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were specifically enacted to ensure that the freed slaves had equal rights under the law. Shortly after emancipation, Congress passed the 15th Amendment that ensured equal voting rights for all citizens, regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Women's attempts to have gender included in the amendment failed. Reasonable congressmen felt that the Civil War had not been fought over the status of women, but for the freedom of 5 million black slaves. Women were not included in the 1860 constitutional amendments because they had never been excluded from society. The original Constitution did not make reference to or exclude gender. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bailey wrote in an 1873 editorial that man is or should be woman's protector and defender. And throughout history, social customs have assigned women to a special privileged and protected class. Therefore, women did not need a special amendment. Some women's suffrage groups openly criticized Congress for exclusion of women from the 15th Amendment. One prominent white feminist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, used strong racist and elitist arguments against placing the enfranchisement of black males above the concerns of white women. According to the author Eric Foner, Stanton said, think of Sambo, who does not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declarations of Independence, making laws for Lydia Maria Child, Lucretia Mott, or Fanny Kimball. The feminist attacks attempted to drive wedges between black women and black men. Stanton spoke out in support of voting rights for white members of the sisterhood. The black women, she contended, would be better off as the slave of an educated white man than a degraded, ignorant black one. Racism is different from sexism in both intent and effect, as Sojourner Truth, a black activist, heroine, and feminist, aptly noted during a women's convention in 1851. After listening to white males discuss white women as a protected class, she dramatically rose to her feet and said, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. Nobody ever helped me into carriages. And ain't I the woman? I would work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it. And I would bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold off into slavery. And when I cry out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Sojourner Truth's point was that she suffered not because she was a woman, but because she was black. Had she not been black, she would have been in the same protected class with white females. Apparently, Sojourner's effort to draw the distinction between race and gender fell on deaf ears and continues to be intentionally misinterpreted. Feminists continue to compete against blacks. The issue of gender protection under the Constitution arose again in 1964 when a Southern congressman insisted that women be included and amended to the Civil Rights Act. However, equality of the sexes was a lesser concern than undermining the bill's power to help blacks. Racist conservatives rose up in support of the amendment. Representative George William Andrews of Alabama says, unless the amendment is adopted, the white woman of this country would be drastically discriminated against in favor of a Negro woman. This attempt to derail the civil rights movement succeeded. The amendment easily passed, signaling the start of a trend by liberal politicians and organizations to push blacks even further on the back burner by equating other categories of people who considered themselves equally aggrieved to blacks. The right movement soon expanded to include not only women, but Hispanics, Asians, Jews, the handicapped, gays, senior citizens, immigrants, drug users, migrant workers, the mentally ill, and the illegal aliens. But the biggest push went for women, since even a racist white male knew that promoting benefits for women would be little more than redistributing wealth to his white mother, sister, daughter, or wife. Thus, the wealth power would not leave the white race. Myth number 7. Black feminism. The popular feminist movement has injured relationships between black women and black men. The sophisticated use of racism and capitalism has placed black women in a position of being a major competitor of black men for jobs, education, housing, and other services and necessary resources, says Haki R. Madhubuti in his book Black Men: Obsolete, Single, Dangerous. Madhubuti explained the conflict between black men and black women, saying, "Black women did not place themselves in this delicate position as a ward of the system. They have been maneuvered and strategically used for the benefit of the white majority, just as the black man has. Although their gains has not been quite as spectacular as those of white females, black females have improved their historical advantage over black males. Black women have always been more acceptable to the dominant white society. As with white feminists, black feminist has always been present, but has been fairly low key. Black women have always been able to find work when black men could not. They were more preferable because they were less threatening. Black women are also beneficial for government reporting purposes, since a black female counts both as a female and a black. In 1954, the income of black women surpassed black males, and the income gap has continued to widen. Black women could work, go to school, socialize, and breed with whites when black males could not. Slavery intentionally placed black women in matriarchal roles in order to dominate black men. Not only did such role reversals weaken the black family structure, they also placed the black female in closer physical and symbolic proximity to the white male. White males' power position afforded them sexual access to black females. A white male with a black female mistress was an acceptable part of Southern life and was often part of the rites of manhood for young white males. Black males were forced into a status below the black female, were totally powerless to protect black females. Today, the rise of the black sisterhood has the potential to be a divisive and destructive social phenomenon that could impede black self-empowerment. The black sisterhood here refers to black women who have indirectly joined with white males and white females to further depress black males. Using black females to subordinate black males places the race where it was centuries ago. In slavery, female slaves were typically field drivers who set the work pace and task for male slaves. Though many worked alongside the male slaves, they were usually given easier management jobs, supervising children's crews and trash gangs. Within the household, black females were typically surrogate overseers of the entire yard staff, as well as the slaveholders' young children. The black female advice was sought and accepted in family household matters. Up until the civil rights period, the black female's domestic authority was exceeded only by the white master and mistress. Black males as a class were never granted the full social and economic options to play out the male role as head of the black family and household. More than a third of black males today are unemployed, poorly educated, on parole, probation, or prison, and have a life expectancy that is 20 years shorter than a white female and 10 years shorter than of a black female. Black males are an endangered species. That has been the case historically. They were enslaved on a ratio of 2 to 1 for every black female. As far back as the 1840s, certain southern states enacted an annual $5 per capita tax on free black males in order to punish them for simply being black, male, and free. Racism historically has been a male-to-male phenomenon. a device to strengthen one male's group at the expense of other. Debates about sexism thwart meaningful discussions about racism, further divides a weakened race and underscores the weakened condition of the black males. Blacks are already low among the ranking of racial and ethnic groups in America, if not the world. Some black women often fail to understand that if sex discrimination disappears, the white female will again simply join the white male on the vendetta of the plantation house or in the suburbs, and the black women will once again serve the mint juleps. Obstacle number 5: criminalizing blacks. The criminalizing of blacks, especially black males, is a major obstacle to black empowerment for at least 3 reasons. Number 1, American society has long linked crime to blacks, especially young black males. Number 2, blacks have been forced to live in marginal social conditions that produce pathological survival behavior. And 3, black communities lack an accountability mechanism that could establish, reward, and punish behavior that is detrimental to them. Since in the late 1960s, blacks have been so overexposed to black crime within their communities that they now accept it as normal black behavior. National public policies and institutions began centuries ago to produce and perpetuate the laws, racial images, and myths that imprisoned blacks within the concepts of crime and violence. For blacks, criminal justice has never been blind. White society criminalized black behavior out of fear and financial self-interest. According to Leonard Curry, the author of The Free Black in Urban America, 1800 through 1850, blacks were arrested for activities that would not have been a crime for whites, such as strolling in certain neighborhoods and looking suspicious. Sometimes blacks were imprisoned for even less specific crimes, such as violating various city ordinances and playing games with whites. In some instances, no crimes were committed. White planters would commit blacks to prison just for safekeeping. All of these incarcerations showed up in the records as black crimes against society. An abusive use of the legal systems to criminalize black primarily occurred in urban areas where the white power structure had fewer options for controlling and using blacks. As far back as 1826 in Massachusetts, free blacks were less than 1% of the population, but nearly 17% of the prisoners. In Pennsylvania, blacks were 2% of the population, but nearly 34% of the prisoners. In New Jersey, blacks were also only 2% of the population, but nearly 50% of the prisoners. Today, blacks still make up 35 to 50% of the state federal penal total population. Approximately 37% of America's black male population is either in jail or on parole or probation. The criminalizing phenomena has destroyed black individual families and communities. The criminalizing of blacks does not excuse blacks who are engaging in criminal activities from being held accountable for their behavior, but the black communities should hold them accountable, not only the majority white society that fosters the conditions that encourages blacks to commit criminal acts. Many blacks have in the past and will continue to commit petty blue-collar crimes in the future, but But all behavior is because whether it is perceived as being good or bad. It should not be noted, therefore, that black crimes markedly increased at the same time and in direct proportion to blacks becoming obsolete and expendable as a labor class in the 1960s. As black wealth, income, employment, business, educational, and male role models opportunities diminished throughout the country, black criminal activities increased. If American justice were to ever be colorblind, crime would have to be redefined and fairly enforced. For instance, white lawbreakers would not be treated any differently for their white collar crimes than blue collar criminals. The term white collar crime was coined in 1940 and referred to illegal acts carried out by respectable members of the community or persons of high status in the course of the occupations. And white collar crimes are usually nonviolent offenses carried out by respectable people to gain money, property, or personal benefits through deceit. John Fairley stated in his book Sociology, the white collar crimes cost the society from $40 to $200 billion a year, not including the savings and loan thefts. This is 8 times the cost of all common blue collar crimes. Yet our prisons are 99% filled with blue collar criminals who are predominantly black. With so many more expensive white collar crimes being committed, why are there not more white collar prisoners? Because most white collar criminals are committed primarily by whites, and crime statistics are skewed towards reporting blue collar crimes. White collar crimes go to the civil rather than criminal courts and are typically excluded from crime reports. When crimes such as inside stock trading, toxic waste dumping, embezzlement, bribery, income tax evasion, expense accounts padding, larceny, computer fraud, money laundering, extortion, blackmail, counterfeiting, government contract manipulations, and savings and loan thefts are included in the crime reports, the typical criminal turns out to be wealthy and white. In terms of acts of violence, personal injuries, and deaths, a California public health official stated that the medical quackery causes more deaths in the United States every year than all blue collar crimes of violence. Yet few quacks ever go to jail, and none of them have ever been sentenced to the electric chair for medical malpractice. For even the rare case where individuals are arrested and convicted for white collar crimes, they receive light sentences and are frequently sent to resort prisons. Criminals should be arrested and prosecuted regardless of color of the collar or color of the skin. Whites do not commit as many blue collar crimes. Their privileged status, contacts, options, and wealth give them greater access to basic necessities and resources of the society without their having to commit criminal acts. Until Black America breaks the shackles of black criminality, either actual and imagined, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to achieve economic and political self-sufficiency and self-empowerment. Conclusion. The greatest impediment to black empowerment and economic justice has been the Constitution, which institutionalized the relative social and economic status of blacks and whites and codified racism in America. After using the Constitution to expropriate black labor, create a racial order of acceptability, and foster a wealth and power imbalance between blacks and whites, the government and the court systems are now using the Constitution to impede any effort to correct the disparities. The government and the courts now allege that any preferential treatment for blacks would be unconstitutional, reverse discrimination. The Constitution ought to be just as supportive or tolerant of affirmative action, set asides, and preferential treatment for blacks as it has been for whites. Indeed, in all their wisdom, the drafters of the Constitution had to have known that discrimination against blacks was in fact preferential treatments for whites.